Hello, everybody. This is Todd with Todd's Pod. This is our third episode. Today, we're going to be talking about the brain, the science behind addiction, and what all that looks like. I have a guest today that has a lot of knowledge in that area, and he's a good friend of mine, Rick Green. And I'm going to tell you a little story about Rick Green real quick. I can show you recovery.
Well, yeah, sure, absolutely.
When I went into treatment, the very first meeting I went to when I was sober for like a little bit was his Thursday night Road to Happy Destiny meeting. And I went there, and here's this guy sitting up there, and I'm still very early recovery. He's talking about recovery and everything. And I'm thinking to myself, and then he said something real stupid. He said he had 7 years of sobriety. I'm like, okay, sobriety's not a real thing. This guy's going to go home, kick his feet up, and have a beer and just laugh at the fact that we're lapping all this stuff up. And that's truly how I felt. And it wasn't until a couple of meetings later that I started realizing that these guys were going to keep coming back every Thursday. And but about 2 months into recovery is when I started seeing that it is possible to live sober, that there is a life outside of all that. I think it's funny because in my story, when I talk to people, everybody said, well, the first meeting I went to, there was a guy up there with 7 years recovery, big beard. I didn't believe him at all. So without further ado, Rick, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, I appreciate that. No, I used to say all the time, bringing that meeting, those 12-step meetings that really help people, but we can't talk about them because we have to remain anonymous, right? Yeah, right. Anyway, bringing a meeting down there was just the highlight of my week every week. And we'd come down there and be really happy. And I remember Todd was like, you guys are faking this. You can't be happy. What is wrong with you guys? They're like, no, we're happy in recovery. And we really are. It's better than our life was before. I mean, I never had any joy or serenity or peace or contentment that was sustainable in my life till I got in recovery. And so, yeah, when you've never seen that before, like I had, and somebody comes down there, and I went to publicly funded treatment just like you. And back then we didn't have, and if you didn't have insurance through your employer, you didn't have insurance. And it was, I remember thinking, how could these guys be happy? And sure enough, things happen and the brain heals and you learn how to self-regulate and things start getting better. So,
yeah, I could agree with that. You know, I used to hear old timers say it just keeps getting better. I thought, no, that can't be true. Can't be true. Well, you know,
but it does get better.
And now I'm at 7 years, and people probably looking at me like this guy's not for real. But the thing is that, you know, it does just keep getting better. Maybe not, the increments are different. In the beginning, it goes up, and it kind of plateaus a little, then it goes up, and those plateaus get a little longer, a little shorter jump, but it does continuously seem to keep getting better as long as I keep doing the next right thing.
As long as you just keep working on it. It's never a straight line. Nothing in life really is a straight line.
Right.
You know, wouldn't be any fun if it was. So that's where the challenges are the fun part.
I'm going to dig into your brain.
Okay, dig into the brain.
So you have intrigued me and fascinated me many times with some of your conversations about what the brain does and about how it reacts. I believe that you were involved in some kind of a thing where they were going to do you could do a test and tell us if we had that gene or whatever. I'll let you explain it because I don't understand it.
Yeah, sure. So, I should tell you a little bit about my background. So, so now I'm in the treatment world, and I do a lot of different things with treatment. I own a treatment center, and we are long-term medically integrated treatment center, specifically for people that have felony DWI charges and professional licensing issues. So we see them for 3 to 5 years. And part of the reason we do this is we know how long it takes the brain to heal. And this is a program similar to the Airline Pilots Association, HIMSS program. We try to add more monitoring and treatment because we have to protect the public. And if we have airline pilots or nurses or whatever in the program like we do, we have to protect their professional licensing and their patients and customers as well. So it's a very serious treatment center. And that's one thing I do. And I do a lot of work with molecular testing. But we believe that, and I don't think this is controversial, that addiction is a genetically driven brain disease. So I've never worked with a patient, and, I could ask you and how many people it's always somebody else in their family has had addiction, usually a direct relative. It's usually either grandma, grandpa, mom, dad, aunt, uncle.
Right.
And then usually it'll be children or grandchildren. So, what is the common here? We used to think back in the day, well, it's the environment. They had similar environments, but even the twin studies where twins were, in different areas, we were seeing this. So behavioral genetics is real. Caitlin Page Hardin at University of Texas, who I've never met, by the way, but she wrote a great book called The Genetic Lottery. And she talks about, it's a bit controversial, but it's true that genetics influence behavior to a great extent. I believe even more than environment, truth be told, in influencing things like success in life. And people don't want to hear that, but you can't let political correctness get in the way of scientific truth. And that's really what we're at. So with addiction, we truly do believe it's a genetically driven brain disease. I saw that back in the day when I was working in pain medicine. We would have patients that came in for years on amounts of opiates that were way above what we would see in equivalent opiate use with a street heroin addict. I hate that term, but everybody knows what we're talking about. So one thing about opiates is there's morphine unit equivalents. So there's an equivalent unit for a gram of heroin to morphine, to fentanyl, to codeine, to hydrocodone. So in a way, an opiate is an opiate is an opiate, right? And so we would see people coming in with fentanyl, oxycodone, hydrocodone, and morphine all at once. And what happened was their pain management doctors got to the point where it's like, I can't give them any more medication and their pain's not controlled. And we would detox them and their pain would get better. And it is possible to give somebody a comfortable, safe, functional detox, but it's not available on demand.
Right.
I wish it were.
Definitely.
I wish you could walk into any hospital in the United States if you had, were dependent on any drug and get a comfortable, safe detox. But that's not our system. And even most physicians will tell you they're not trained and they don't know how to do that.
During my addiction, one thing I did learn, and I'm sure that San Antonio is no different than anywhere else in the country, was if I needed to detox or if it got so bad out of control, I had to go in there and tell them I was going to kill myself.
Yeah.
Basically to get the help that I need. But really what I tell people now is, you know what? You are killing yourself.
Yes.
So you're not really lying. But yeah, that's and you're right. I think it should be available on demand.
On demand.
Yeah,
I mean,
definitely.
Why? Any other life-threatening illness we have to treat.
Right.
I mean, you can get in trouble in some states if somebody has a life-threatening illness and they fall down in front of you and you just walk past them.
Correct.
But how many times have anybody who's watching this been downtown in any major city in the United States, seen somebody horribly addicted to drugs and just walk right on by?
Yes,
you
sir.
have to. There's nothing you can do.
Right.
You can't force them to get treatment. If they wanted it, good luck navigating it. But I say that because we would detox them, and the people who didn't have the family didn't have a relative with alcohol use disorder, substance use disorder, some kind of addiction, they wouldn't act like addicts once we detoxed them. They didn't have craving. They weren't drug seeking. Their emotional regulation was okay. The poor individuals, that we did detox that did have that genetic burden for addiction, they would act like addicts. Their pain would, my pain's bad. They were drug seeking and looking for bad, so we genetically tested them. The genetic test I like is called the Genetic Addiction Risk Score Test. And unfortunately it's not available right now. It's off the market, but if you get a full genetic sequence, you can put together those genes to replicate the Genetic Addiction Risk Score Test. But we would see people with a high genetic GARS score when we detox them would act like addicts, for lack of a better term, people with substance use disorder, to be politically correct. And the people that we detoxed that didn't have that genetic burden wouldn't. So, the idea is back to it. If we can get back around our heads that there is physiological addiction that's not true addiction. I call that pseudo addiction. There's different definitions for pseudo addiction. The pseudo addiction is when you become addicted to a substance and you don't have a genetic burden for addiction. Real addiction or real substance use disorder is a sequelae or a symptom or a sign of reward deficiency syndrome, which is having this genetic burden for lack of dopamine functioning. We call it hypodopaminergic.
Okay.
So that's the terms we like to use, but it just means low dopamine functioning. Most of the genes that we're concerned about affect the dopamine system in the brain, and it affects the receptors. So it affects how the dopamine receptors work, how they process dopamine, how dopamine transports from one receptor to the other, how long it stays on the receptor. It's very fascinating how much dopamine you make. You can't just take somebody's brain and inject it full of dopamine and they feel great. That doesn't go well at all. Ask any Parkinson's patient who takes too much dopamine how it feels. It has to be the right dopamine on the right place, and the receptor has to do the right thing. You know, a lot of people don't know this, but cocaine is a dopamine uptake selective dopamine uptake inhibitor. So
That's
why
I love cocaine.
You know, yeah, right.
Yeah.
So like Prozac is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Cocaine is a dopamine reuptake inhibitor.
Okay.
So it keeps dopamine on the receptor doing what it needs to do, and it keeps it from cycling. So it just makes what dopamine you have work more intensely in the right way.
Oh, so you're not producing more dopamine.
You're just using it. You're using it better.
Okay, that's interesting.
So
I didn't know that.
So our state license for our treatment program actually says we treat reward deficiency syndrome. Group of researchers, myself in 2022, we applied to CDC for that to become an official disorder. It is in the Sage Encyclopedia of Psychiatric Disorders, Psychological Disorders, but it's not in the DSM-5, our purple book where we diagnose things. I'm a therapist specializing in chemical dependency, if I refer to that, but it's not in our big purple book yet, but it's in other diagnosable literature. But it needs a CPT code, and we also talked about calling it dopamine reward system disorder. But that's really what it's about: having these genes that stop the dopamine or the dopamine reward cascade from working normally. And when you have reward deficiency syndrome, you can develop a plethora of issues, and addiction is just one of them. When I say addiction too, I mean alcohol as well as drugs.
Right.
You know, alcoholism is alcohol addiction, right? So,
and alcohol is a drug.
And it is a drug.
Yeah.
It's a very toxic drug.
Yes.
You know?
I think it's one of the most deadly because you can buy it on any corner.
Yeah, you can buy it on any corner. If it didn't have the side effects that it has, I think everybody, just for the positive effects, would be drunk right now. It's that good at hitting all the receptors. I mean, it hits the dopamine, it hits the endorphins, it hits the serotonin, it hits the endocannabinoid receptors. It lowers the stress receptors and stress neurotransmitters like glutamate and GABA. It's an amazing drug in a lot of ways, other than the side effects. You know, side effects are it's very toxic. Right. What other drug can you use to get high, to get intoxicated, that you can sterilize equipment with? You know?
Yeah.
I mean, it's that toxic, and people forget that. You know, I mean, honestly, most things you sterilize a surface or equipment with, you would never put in your body. The alcohol straight in.
Yeah.
You know,
you are correct.
You swallow it. Some people inject it; they get it other ways, but mostly it's oral consumption, and it's very toxic. Very damaging to the gut, which then causes more brain problems. But yeah, to answer your question, the brain is infinitely complex. What we are dealing with mostly is issues with the reward system in the brain. That genetic function is not, the genetic burden is causing a lack of normal reward. So that manifests like this. And Ken Blum wrote a beautiful paper. He's the father of addiction genetics. And Ken discovered the first gene that's associated with alcohol use disorder in 1990 at San Antonio's Health Science Center. I think he was working with UCLA researchers at the same time, but what are we, 15 miles from where the first gene was discovered with very old technology, very old gel technology. They found a needle in a haystack. But Ken, you know, after years of researching this and finding genes and seeing their effect and seeing the disorders they're associated with, he said this: if you have reward deficiency syndrome like I do, like my children do, it's difficult for us to feel normal reward. It's difficult for us to get excited and up for things. And people are like, well, what does that mean? I said, well, I've never had a patient to watch Dancing with the Stars. Nothing against it. That they'll say, no one watches that. I'm like, oh, really? Go look at the ratings. Go look how much money that is made for Disney. And it's not just women. It's not old people. It's a lot of different people in walks of life really enjoy that TV show. That would be absolute torture for one of my patients if you made them, as a punishment, watch that show. They want to see Game of Thrones final episode, the battle. They want to see swords, dragons, the unveiling of the secrets. That's what they want to see.
So that's part of that genetic thing. So
it's genetically driven.
Is that why I could never sit and watch Dancing with the Stars?
Exactly.
Or another one that I couldn't really watch is those. I don't like reality shows very much.
They're boring.
And like Lost and all those, when there's not a lot there. Yeah. I never, I don't get into those. But the Game of Thrones, man, I watch every single episode.
But if there's not a battle, then you're angry.
Exactly.
Like, where was there no battle?
Funny, my wife looks at me and she says, "Oh, there ain't enough killing in this one for you."
Right.
Yeah.
And some people are, will look at us like, "Oh, that show's too intense. What's wrong with you?"
And I'm like, "Give me more.
Give me more." I'm vicariously in that battle. And that's part of what the dopamine system does. There's, one of the genes we look at, the COMT gene, is called the warrior gene. I say this all the time. It's like people are like, well, I'm worried about my child developing addiction. I'm like, if your son or daughter develops addiction, we can treat it. Treatment works and recovery happens. It's not the worst thing in the world. It can go in permanent remission. I said, but how do I tell? It's like when there's a loud noise, does your child run to it or away from it? If they run to it, you might have a problem. You might have a problem.
Which is the majority of the people.
Right.
Really, if you think about it.
It's about, in the United States, there's estimates around 20-something% of people carry this significant genetic burden. At any given time, 10% have addiction or meet the criteria for substance use disorder. Think about it. So you're checking out at the grocery store and they're busy Saturday and there's 10 people ahead of you. One of them's got most likely a substance use disorder. You don't wear a sign around your neck that says, "Hey, I started this morning with 5 shots and I hit my flask before I came in.
Yeah.
My Starbucks cup has vodka in it." It doesn't. You don't know. Just like the person in line there may have diabetes. They're not going to have a sign that says, "Well, I took my insulin. I took my glucose this morning and I had to dose my insulin and make sure I took my medication. I picked it up at the pharmacy." It's just we don't know. It's not in our face. But with the stigma around addiction, we don't talk about it as much. Probably more people are more likely to admit they have diabetes or hypertension than they are substance use disorder.
I agree with that.
So that's where, when we talk about the brain, that's the thing. So Ken talks about this. He goes, it's difficult for them to feel reward, difficult to get excited. And by them, I mean me. Difficult when you have reward deficiency syndrome. It's difficult to feel reward. It's difficult to get excited for reward. Reward is very fleeting. It doesn't last very long. You'll notice a lot of us move from hobby to hobby. We get very into something and then we're done. We move on to the next one. Or we're always novelty seeking, looking for the new thing. But it's very easy to feel negative emotion. And a lot of people don't want to talk about that. They don't even know. I can't take your soul out of your body and put it in a normal person so you can see how they experience the world. A lot of them wake up in the morning and they're happy. I remember that just about my whole life. Like, why are you happy in the morning? But there are people that wake up like that. They experience normal reward. They're not anxious. They're not afraid. They're not depressed. These are some of the things we see. And then you have the other issue in that your typical person with alcohol use disorder, Daryl Ndaba, who was he's a doctor of pharmacy, and was the pharmacist at the Haight-Ashbury Clinic. Great honor. I got to present with him once on stage, which is funny because he wrote the first textbook I ever had in this field, and I'm sitting there presenting with him. Surreal, but he said he follows groups long term, and the higher the IQ of the group, the more likely they are to develop substance use disorder. And he found that people with substance use disorder have an IQ that's half a standard deviation higher than average. So just to give you an idea what that is, to lower your IQ a half a standard deviation, you'd have to do something like give yourself lead poisoning. So it's tremendous. So when you and I know this, some of the most clever people we knew have ever met in our lives are with people with substance use disorder.
I agree with that.
So, when the substance use disorder is in remission and they can channel that intelligence and that problem solving into something positive, they can do amazing things. Look at all of the celebrities like Robert Downey Jr. He may be the wealthiest actor on the planet right now, and he does a lot for recovery. But Sir Anthony Hopkins, Sir Elton John, David Letterman, Craig Ferguson, Eminem, who I believe Elton John's a sponsor in that program we can't talk about.
He is.
It just goes on and on and on about the success people can get when they're sober. You got to go, there's something to this. They're creative, they're smart, they're successful. But our brains respond to reinforcing substances that spike dopamine more than a normal person. We know this. Nora Volkoff, who's the director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse, she started doing functional MRIs decades ago, as soon as they came out, and she saw substantial differences between addicted brains and non-addicted brains. And it just even the cues, the visual cues, showing a picture of a drug lights up our brains different than a normal person. So it just works better. People say, why do addicts become addicted? Because it works. It works better in them,
Yeah. And like you say, I find that most addicts are super intelligent.
Oh, yeah.
They have to be or they can't survive.
No,
it's interesting
driven
because,
to it.
yeah. But I have a couple questions.
Sure. No. Anyway, so did I answer the question about the brain? Is that
pretty much?
Brain, it's genes. Genes affect the receptors in the brain, which affects the reward system.
I think we could do this like 5 podcasts
Probably.
and still not have all the information we want. So my question and curiosity that I have, so let's take me for instance, okay? I'm sure that I have that genetic
we never tested you, did we?
No, never tested me. You should.
We were talking about it.
We talked about it, yeah. And so but what I'm wondering, even people that don't have that genetic possibility as far as that problem with the dopamine, if you are born in your childhood and you have severe abuse throughout your childhood, can that also change?
So, okay, that's fascinating. So 2 things. People say trauma causes addiction. And I say, not really. Trauma turbocharges addiction.
Right.
Trauma is the rocket fuel. What does trauma do? Trauma is something bad happened that you can't get over. What does that do? Give chronic bad feelings. What do we do when we feel bad? We want to feel better. What works really well in us to make us feel better? Drugs and alcohol. It's that simple. But trauma, the environment, and they're doing this. The researchers at University of Texas are doing this research right now. We know, and there are other places as well, the epigenetics, the changes to the genes happen from the environment. And we know that trauma and stress, even psychological stress, can affect the genes that cause dopamine to not function as well. So it's like, what do you mean changes? Well, little globules of methyl get stuck onto the receptor. That's how onto the gene. I'm sorry. That's the kind of epigenetics we're talking about. We can actually measure it now. Now we can't measure it commercially. I can't just run that test on somebody. It has to be done in a laboratory. But yeah, we can see that some of the changes that happen due to the environment, and that's really important. We don't know how important it is yet, but we know it's very important.
Do you have the ability to look at that and tell, okay, so this person has X percentage of change due to, or he was born this way? Can we look at it and tell?
We can't tell. Well, here's what's really terrifying, by the way, about talking about born this way. So epigenetic changes are handed down. So there was a time where everyone kind of thought your genes are your genes and they don't change. And then we found out about epigenetics. We're like, oh my gosh, genes can actually be damaged and change. And then we found out you can hand those down to your offspring. More likely, you're going to hand them down to your grandchildren and great-grandchildren.
Hmm.
That comes from basically, I think it started from research out of Scandinavia after World War II. There was a lot of starvation in Scandinavia during World War II. And we found that the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the people who survived the starvation periods had a high incidence of type 2 diabetes. Despite being thin, they had type 2 diabetes. We found it was due to epigenetic changes.
Interesting.
Yeah, kind of
Very
terrifying, actually.
Yeah.
But, you know, if you can, now there's also, I like to always say hope. There is hope. It looks like there is such thing as epigenetic repair.
Oh.
So it may be that recovery, I think, the things we're doing in the rooms and helping each other and working those 12-step programs and all the concepts and tenets help us, you know, regulate our emotions. Then we feel better. We take care of ourselves physically and mentally and spiritually. And then that helps our genes repair, I think. I'm pretty sure.
So spiritual was a big part of my recovery.
Yeah,
I mean, I think, you know, spirituality is huge.
Right.
But my question now is, you know, when I first got into recovery, of course I had all that negativity going on and everything was negative. I mean, you were drunk.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, but you weren't. But anyway, so
Yeah.
and that's just the way I saw the world, right?
Mhm.
So after I went through recovery, about maybe, I don't know, a year in, I discovered that I did not like negativity at all.
Right.
And so I basically, I believe that I trained my brain to be positive and to
Right.
see positivity and not even address negativity, not just, oh,
Yeah.
I mean, it's there and I see it. If it's something that I need to deal with, I'll deal with it. But basically, more or less, I'm gonna be a cup half full rather than a cup half empty. And I think I trained myself to do that.
Yeah.
Okay. So I wake up happy.
Right.
And I've trained my brain to do a lot of stuff because I realize that if I get up in the morning and I say, oh, my back hurts, my back's going to hurt like hell the rest of the day. If I
Yeah.
don't say those words, if I don't speak that, it tends to not hurt as bad.
Right.
So is it possible, because now it's like second nature to me.
Mhm.
Did I train my brain to be positive, or did the recovery process and the work that I did in recovery help to change my brain?
Well, I would probably say both.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd probably say both.
Okay.
It's funny you say that glass half full. I've never told anybody this. The people that I've had a conversation with was this. So when I was in my internship, I had to work. It's hard. It was very difficult what I had to do in my internship. The level of paperwork that we had to do and the degree of compliance, we call it, was just crushing. And I had Fridays basically an office day. By the end of the day, Friday, every time I'd be like, I'd have this existential crisis. Are we literally just trying to convince people the glass is half full? Is that when we're treating substance use disorder, we're trying to show them hope?
Right.
But really, and then I began to realize that's really what it's about, perspective.
Right.
We cannot, maybe all normal people, there's never enough good enough stuff on the planet for us. We have to make a conscious effort to choose to be grateful for what we have and to appreciate what we have and to say that's good enough for right now and be pleased with it. Otherwise, we'll always want more better, more this, more that. There's not enough good stuff in the world to make me feel okay. It's happiness, like Dennis Prager says, happiness is an inside job.
Right.
You can't count on external things to keep you happy. This has all been positive psychology out of University of Pennsylvania, which I think was University of Missouri, Kansas City. Chris Martin, actually, I think he came up with these concepts before they did it. But his was quality of motivation theory. But basically, they found that lottery winners, a year after they won the lottery, are no more happy than they were before they won it. But
I've seen those studies.
But people who keep a gratitude list and not even every day, just once or twice a week, were more happy at the end of the year. So if you want to win the lottery, keep a gratitude list. I tell my sponsees a lot. It's like when you go into a meeting this week, take your big book out and write real small 5 things you're grateful for, or people. You can usually look around the room and see 5 people you're grateful for.
Right.
And it changes them. So
I used to do a grateful list every day. Just be a grateful list and an intention list.
oh wow,
That's
high tech. I haven't done that.
So,
now you're challenging me now, Todd.
Well, so if I tell you what I'm grateful for and I tell you what my intention for the day is, most likely I'm going to try to achieve that intention. Okay, it's something about the verbal spoke. So I would make my list, but I also spoke my list because I firmly believe that I can think something for weeks, right? But until I verbalize it, it doesn't seem to stay. But if I verbalize things, they seem to stay there. I just seem to connect.
Program that brain.
I guess so. I don't know.
I mean, it makes sense. It makes sense. It's what we're talking about is being grateful. We're talking about hedonic adjustment. There's actually a term for this. And so it just means what was good enough last week isn't good enough anymore. You got to go further. And what really concerns me is these.
Right.
This feeds you what spikes your dopamine, whether it's a news feed or a game or one of the social media apps that I won't mention because I don't want to get us banned from certain countries. It spikes dopamine and it feeds you, and it can actually, then you get hedonic adjustment. You do more and more and more. And now we have people spending up to half their week in front of their screens, their phones. Terrifying.
Question.
Yes.
Okay. So I believe through my recovery, I've learned that I have an ability to be addicted to anything. It could be food. It could be anger. It could be phones.
Right.
I find myself, if I'm not careful on the phone, if I get into those little clips, I might get stuck in those little clips, and I got to pull myself away from it. Same way with food, man. I gained like 60 pounds or something, and I've had to work really hard to lose that weight.
But you're looking good. Good job.
You're looking good also.
Full-blown AIDS. No, I'm just kidding. That's a joke. That's a joke. Yeah. No.
So it's like, and so that's kind of where I look at my future in recovery is addressing everything. Because really, I think if you're an addict or an alcoholic, you have the ability to be addicted to anything. So a lot of times I find people replace things with things.
Oh, absolutely.
But they got to moderate what they do, right? So is that the same type addiction that Gene would create through the Facebook or the food?
Absolutely. So what you're talking about is cross addiction. Right. That's what we call it. Some people call it switching addictions, but cross addiction. This is difficult. Okay. Having this conversation with sponsees, when they've been sober for a while, it's like, look, man, abstinence is easy. Moderation is really hard. And they're looking at me like I lost my mind, but they're like, oh yeah. I'm like, would you like to moderate crack cocaine? No, that's impossible. Yeah. Okay. Well, you can't moderate. You can't abstain from, I should say, food. You can't abstain from media permanently. You can't abstain from your job. There are things that you can't abstain from your family. You can't abstain from working with others. All those things can be addictive. Codependency is a big problem we'll see sometimes with people when they start sponsoring. Anything to focus that spikes that dopamine and gives us focus, we have to be very careful with that cross addiction. And the research that's been done, especially by Ken Blum and his group, shows that certain genes are associated with certain cross addictions, believe it or not. So not only do we know in general what your risk is of developing alcohol use disorder or substance use disorder, we also know what the risk is maybe of a gambling disorder. Right. I stay away from gambling. Yeah, I do too. Yeah, I do too. I don't like it. But I know if I did, I probably would. Yeah. Just like alcohol, most people alcohol, I like the feeling, but I didn't like the taste. I didn't like the side effects, but you do it long enough, you're going to like it. That happens to opiate addicts a lot too. They'll be like, I don't really like alcohol, so I can drink. And like, you'll like it. You got the genes, eventually you'll like it. Same thing with addicts, with alcoholics, they'll, develop a pain problem and get, start taking opiates, and they'll be like, well, I don't really like opiates. Oh, you will. It may take you a few weeks, but you're going to cross over. A lot of them love opiates, but some of them don't, and you will eventually. When you get used to the side effects, it'll be another addiction.
Speaking of opiates, I tell everybody in part of my story that I truly believe that God got me addicted to heroin on purpose, and mine did start in a pain management out of Dallas. Yeah. And then when I came to San Antonio, they were like, "Well, you don't need all this." Yeah. And of course, like you said, you're going to find that relief somewhere. So I spent 10 years addicted to heroin.
Yeah.
And I learned what addiction truly was. Before that, I started out with crank way back in the day, right?
Oh yeah.
That was my first drug. Alcohol at 9, but crank, I don't know, somewhere later, 18, 19. But once it got out of control, I quit it in one day. So I'm not a drug addict, but I had a handful of cocaine.
Yeah.
And then when the cocaine got out of control, I quit it one day. So I'm still not a drug addict, right?
Right.
That was when mushrooms, weed, and whiskey came in.
Oh,
That era, right?
that's an interesting combo.
Yeah, yeah, it is. So then,
Now you had cigarettes in there too, right?
of course,
Oh,
cigarettes
yeah.
all along. I only recently quit smoking cigarettes. That's pretty recent.
Good job. That's probably one of the hardest addictions to stop.
It's tough.
Honestly,
It's tough. So everything I did, like when the whiskey got out of control, I quit it in a day. So I'm not an alcoholic, but boom, I'm right back with cocaine.
Yeah.
So I never really quit anything, but I was that asshole guy that would walk up to you and say, "Man," and I'd be high or drunk. I quit one day, so why can't you?
Yeah, exactly.
And it wasn't until I got the heroin addiction that I realized just what addiction was, because I don't care what you got in this hand, you are not going to quit doing heroin.
Right.
It's not a switch off thing. And so I believe I believe God put me through every day of my life to bring me where I am today. Okay.
Yeah.
And so that heroin addiction had to happen, or I couldn't do what I do now.
Oh yeah. I mean, probably somebody's going to see what we're talking about here and get a big benefit from it. That would not have happened if you and I hadn't been through where we've been through. Right. We got here not because things was a golden highway of progress. It was a ugly, rocky road with a lot of pain. Mm-hmm. And that's what our main message is. No matter what you're going through in life, there is a way through it.
Right.
We're living proof. You can be happy again. It is possible. Don't give up. Keep trying. But most of us don't even know what to do. But you bring that up, but like, well, I'm not an addict. I quit in one day. It's so funny. Everybody makes their own definition of what an addict is or an alcoholic. And it's never what it is clinically. Clinically is, do you use substances and bad things happen?
Right.
So when we diagnose somebody with alcohol use disorder or cocaine, stimulant use disorder or whatever, we're looking at 11 criteria, and all those criteria are negative consequences. And people keep using despite the negative consequences. And that's when your diagnosis having a problem.
Well, they turned into a real problem. That's why I had to quit in one day and go to something else. And it's weird because it was a manipulation all the way through. Because the crank people are not the cocaine people. So when you switch, then the family, I wrote those guys off. I'm done with that. Never do that again. I got some new friends though. Yeah, and so it was a switch out. And it's funny, but so another question along a different sort of line. I ran into somebody that had a problem with food.
Okay. What kind of problem with food?
They were obese, and they felt like they just couldn't stop. They couldn't stop eating, and they didn't know what to do. And they tried Weight Watchers. They tried all these things, and in talking to them, they're like, "Oh, well, my problem is not as bad as addiction or alcoholism or any of those things." But it seems to be a bit of a problem. And what I explained to them and what I believe is in the heart, it's in the heart of the maker, man. If your problem is food, you're in just as much misery as I was in my addiction. It's just a different kind of thing, because who can say, what's what? It's like the boy on the bicycle, man in the limo, right? Got a guy in the limo on his phone raising Cain because he's got 2 flats and he's not going anywhere, right? So he's angry, and he's the richest man in town. Boy on the bicycle is crying, holding his allowance money. He's got 1 flat, so he's not going anywhere. The man in the limo is looking at the boy and saying, "Man, you got the rest of your life ahead of you. What's your problem?" Boy's looking at the man like, "Dude, you're the richest man in town. What's your problem?" Well, in their hearts, it's exactly the same.
Problem,
exactly. Right? So I try to tell people that because I want people to understand that if there's a problem, like you said, there is a way to recover from that problem, but we have to be
obese. Okay, so Overeaters Anonymous exists for a reason,
right? Exactly,
and it's a successful program. The only people I know, and I know 3 of them that have lost like 100 pounds or more and kept it off without surgery, are people in the Overeaters Anonymous Fellowship. I've never been there. I don't know exactly their program, but I've seen its results. It is hard to lose weight it is actually easy to lose weight. It's hard to keep it off because the body whipsaws back and your metabolism lowers. And, NIH has done a lot of research on this, and that's the biggest problem. In order to keep weight off, you have to remain at a low calorie level, or we've got to figure out some way to raise the metabolism in the body again. But they did a study on this tribe in Africa that walks or runs a minimum of 9 miles a day, and they had normal body composition. And then they measured people who were sedentary in New York City, in Manhattan, who had normal body composition. They consumed the same amount of calories. The people who run or walk 9 miles a day and the people who are sedentary. So the difference was metabolism. The body fights all the time to let us survive at a certain calorie point. And when we go below it or above it, the body responds differently.
Hunger.
And we store, well, and other things too, the metabolism changes. And so the metabolic rate changes. So we store fat, we have trouble. And I feel very bad. And then of course, people who are overweight get stigma and shamed. And I really think that most people who are overweight cannot control it. They need help. Right. I really wish, again, that too was a medical condition that insurance companies paid for, that people could get medical help with that. Right. Just like addiction, you can get medical help for addiction, but you have to know how to do it. Even if you have the best insurance or all the money in the world, navigating the system is so hard. You can't just show up at the hospital and say, I'm a crack addict, please help me. They're not going to help you.
So looking forward, would you say that you believe we're on the pathway to where, maybe 10 years down the road, that it'll be at a point where you can go to the hospital and say, I have a problem?
Be there. I hope so. Another thing I should tell you is that, I've been on the public policy committee for the National Association of Alcohol, Drug, and Addiction Counselors. And I'm also a member of American Society of Addiction Medicine. So I'm not on the public policy committee for American Society of Addiction Medicine, but I stay on top of what they do and I try to liaison as best I can. That's something that we work on all the time. One of the stigma is really the problem.
Right.
So for instance, right now, Medicare doesn't really pay for addiction treatment.
Right.
Can you believe that?
No.
In our country, you've worked so hard, paid your taxes, raised your children and your grandchildren, and then say at the age of 70, you develop a terrible alcohol and Xanax problem, and Medicare won't pay for your treatment.
That's horrible.
Just go off and die from your addiction. We don't care. When I tell congressional staff that, because we've been working on it very hard, NADAC, ASAM, National Association of Alcohol and National Association of Treatment Providers, NATAP, those three organizations, by the way, formed the Addiction Coalition with SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health the agency, which is part of National Institute of Health. Right. So believe it or not, there are people like me who really work on these things and go to Washington, and we're trying to change it. We're trying to change, the Medicare laws, the Medicare funding. We are. There's a bill right now that would drastically change things. It needs to be passed. It needs to be funded. Please contact your congressman. Most congressional staff don't know that Medicare won't pay for substance use disorder. It's insane. So I hope that, yes, someday. The other problem is 42 CFR. 42 CFR is a level of privacy that's above HIPAA. And it goes back to stigma and shame. People wouldn't come to treatment if they thought a prosecutor could use it against them.
Exactly.
And they can't. Prosecutor cannot use treatment against you. Can't be used in basically any court of law, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this privacy law on top of it. But I think until we get rid of or change that privacy law, you're never going to see addiction treatment in hospitals. You just can't get the level of privacy in the hospital. That sets off another problem. All medical training basically happens in hospitals. So with the privacy law, they can't treat addiction in hospitals. So then people who are being trained, nurses, doctors, et cetera, aren't trained. And that's pharmacists, that's respiratory technicians. Everybody's trained in a hospital setting, but they are not trained on addiction because addiction isn't treated in a hospital. So I think until we get rid of I think once Medicare funds addiction treatment, and once we change 42 CFR, which some people are happy with it, they want it. This is very controversial. I may get lit up in the comments on this. That's fine. I think 42 CR is stigma. Why are we calling a brain disease worse than a physical disease? And it needs more privacy. It plays into the stigma. So I think though when those two things stop, then we can maybe go to, and we've got to keep our advocacy going. As much as you and I love recovery, we understand it's a brain disease. There are people who say, no, it's not. I stopped. Therefore, I know so-and-so stopped. Well, you didn't probably have real addiction. You probably had pseudo addiction, or you stopped and you have dry drunkism and reward deficiency syndrome.
And you're miserable.
And you're miserable. So no, you cannot give yourself addiction. That's absolutely, I've heard that. That's scientifically incorrect. It's a congruence of factors we call the addiction equation that has to happen for you to be addicted. And, we've got to stop treating people who have substance use disorders as second-class citizens or third or fourth-class citizens.
Right.
And we've got to stop blaming them for their disease. I have seen judges in the county we sit say that from the bench. And I can't interject and I want to, when I hear that, that is so wrong. You cannot give yourself alcohol use disorder or substance use disorder. True addiction is a genetically driven brain disease. And that's where the stigma is at. So I also hope that once we finally as a society adopt that, but you remember, how did we get here? This goes back to the Hempstead Act, and most of our drug policies started out in institutional racism.
Right.
The war on drugs. Well, Richard Nixon was a centrist, so he couldn't attack the left or the far right directly. He had to do it through things that represented them. So he did it through drugs. And when the reports came back that weren't the way he wanted, that he funded for research, he got rid of them. And then, Jimmy Carter shut down the majority of the mental health institutes, and so did Ronald Reagan. And then, but President Ford was pretty understanding. His wife, Betty Ford, is a well-known person in recovery, yeah. Right? The Betty Ford Centers, the Hazelden Betty Ford Centers. But then Ronald Reagan, first president I ever really supported, maybe the first one I voted for, he brushed off that playbook. He needed to unify the country. And so he needed an internal enemy, and that was drugs. Just Say No had his wife out there, who looked very thin.
Okay.
I'm just saying, I don't know what her diagnosis were. We weren't supposed to diagnose this, but I just get a feeling that maybe she wasn't okay saying that. And he was, trying to blame addiction on the addict. That's what Just Say No means. You didn't say no, therefore you're a bad person. That's not how it works. What about alcohol? No one told me not to say no to alcohol. Well, you should have said no before it was too much. Oh, okay. That's what that message did. And then you remember we used to have something called the national news that people watched every day before the interwebs.
Yep.
Millennials not Gen Z are like, what in the world? But that's where we would see these crack babies and crack wars and crack. Crack was like this horrible army that was invading our country and going to take us over. But all the pictures we saw that I remember were of African Americans.
I agree. And really, that's a rich drug.
I'm just like, that was institutional racism.
It was because it is a rich man's drug.
It is, and the majority of cocaine has always been used by Caucasians.
And I don't mean that in a racist way.
Just the way it is. It was terrible. So Ronald Reagan needed to unify the country, so he had an internal enemy, drugs, and through imaging, it looked like people of color. And I don't know if that was intentional or not, but that seemed to be the messaging. They sure didn't pull that base in with their voters. And then the external one was the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
So we had an internal and external enemy. At the same time, you had Barry Seal bringing cocaine into the United States in conjunction with the CIA.
Right, exactly.
And it's like,
well, you can't have an enemy if you don't feed their army.
This is just insanity when you look at what was going on. But the messaging, the problem is not really what happened. It's the messaging lingers on. All the Gen X people We were taught that it is right to hate the addict and the alcoholic. Mothers Against Drunk Driving is not a kind, loving organization. They want people who may have some, some people drink and they do horrible things, and they should be punished for it. But for the people that comes from substance use disorder, that's a medical condition. We don't go and lock up somebody with Tourette's syndrome who started saying racial slurs and ticking and started a riot. We don't lock them up for that. Now, if you start a riot, Todd, they're going to lock you up.
Yes.
Okay. The same genes that cause Tourette's syndrome cause out substance use disorder.
Okay.
So that's where we got to see. We got to see this is a disease. The other thing we have to do too is, and this started during the Reagan years, when you and I were in 7th grade, 300,000 people in the United States were incarcerated. Now it's near 3 million. The majority of them that are incarcerated are for substances. Something either directly or things they do to get it. So we were going to criminalize our way out of this problem.
Right.
And that didn't work. So when we realized we're going to treat our way out of this problem, then we'll be okay. And I think, to answer your question, when can you go to a hospital? When we get that mentality from you, me, our families marching in the streets saying, quit arresting us, quit imprisoning us for our disease. We deserve treatment. And the majority of people agree with us.
And even more so, so you go to prison because of your addiction, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then so you do 5 years, and then
Yes.
you get out. No treatment during those 5 years. So
treatment.
you still have that
Mm-hmm.
gene. So you're going to go right back, and then you get 10 years, and nobody ever says, hey, you have a disorder. You need help. Or they'll tell you to go to a meeting and things like that. But it wasn't until things were explained to me in a different way that I could actually grasp and say, oh, it makes sense to me. So hopefully down the road we can get more education in
I
the
hope
US.
so.
And that's one of my drivers is just I tell everybody I can talk to, and if I get in a group, I'm definitely going to speak what I think.
I would really, I hate to say to you this. I hate the idea of incarcerating people to treat them. We need to use the legal system to force them to good treatment.
Right.
And let the insurance companies pick up that tab.
Okay, I agree. But if you're going to incarcerate them, at least come up with a good recovery plan while they're there.
Oh, absolutely.
And they don't have that.
Oh, they don't even get evaluated.
Right.
Sometimes.
So that's another thing that if we were to change, because then people, when they come out, would be less likely to go.
The
right back.
recidivism is really high. Well, for people that complete the substance abuse felons program, being reincarcerated within 3 years is 41%.
Wow.
In Texas.
Wow.
So I think that's safe to say that program's not working.
So there's a program I'm involved with that we work with people that are coming out of incarceration, Bexar County and stuff. And our numbers are, if they complete the program,
if they come out,
if they come out and they complete this program the way that we lay it out for them, I think, well, at one point we had a 10% recidivism over that period of time.
But it's out here in the real world. That's
Right,
where you got to do
yeah.
the treatment, get the support, and learn how to live a happy life without drugs. And remember too, the drugs and alcohol damage the brain. So you got to let the brain heal. Then as you're going along, learn how to live a happy life without drugs and alcohol in the real world, in prison or in a residential treatment center. That's easy.
Yes.
It really is. There's a lot of drugs and alcohol in prison, but you can avoid it. It's easy. But out here in the real world, this is where real world stresses, real world temptations, real world problems happen. But there's this idea that we use substances out of hedonism. We're driven. We want to feel something better than a normal person. No, I don't subscribe to that. It's relief.
Right.
We're seeking relief. We're irritable, restless, and discontent. I see pictures of myself from childhood. I'm like, what? Why is that kid so sad, angry, not happy? And I know now genetically that's the way I was programmed to be. And I think a lot of us, even the ones that are smiling, we're not that way. Or deep down, we weren't happy.
I agree with that.
We're just seeking to try to be normal.
So Rick, I got a question.
Okay, sure.
Will you come back soon and visit with us again?
Sure,
Because we're out of
absolutely.
time.
Okay, good.
And I would love to have you back because there's just so much more.
We can talk.
We can go on and on and on. So, I'll have you back, and I do appreciate you coming and sharing with everybody today.
Always love to.
I want to say goodbye to everybody. Thank you for watching Todd's Pod.